Thank you everybody for joining today for our webinar that we are calling a map for DevOps, or maintaining high velocity with consistent delivery. So I'll give a second for people to join, but as people are joining, just wanted to let you know that we do have a questions panel that you should see in the attendees list. And so as you have questions going through it, feel free to add questions to that, and then we can go through all of the questions that you have at the end. So the first thing that I'd like to do is just to introduce ourselves. And so today's panelists, first I'll start with myself. My name is Colin Schoenfelder. I am the Director of Technology with Macedon Technologies. And two of the different responsibilities that I have is overseeing our Center of Excellence, so all of our kind of internal best practices that we have, and also our in-house solution development, of which MAP is a part of. Now I'll hand it over to David to introduce himself.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Morris. I'm currently a project leader with Macedon Technologies, and I'm in charge of the map stream of development, making sure that all development goes along smoothly and we're hitting all our deadlines on time. I'll be passing along to Wyatt as well, so he can introduce himself.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Wyatt Tinsley. I've been with Macedon for 2 years, and I'm currently a senior consultant. Today, I'm acting as the map lead developer.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, so just to set a little bit of context about how we got here. So Macedon Technologies, we are practitioners that specialize in Appian-centric solutions. And over the course of the time that we have been in business, so for our approaching 12 years now, we've interacted with a lot of different clients, 100 and 450 different engagements. And over that time, one of the big things that has allowed us to be successful is the fact that we are very much into eating our own sourdough, right? So we build out our own back of house applications internally and sort of use that as a learning experience for how we can bring best practices to our clients. And we do that through our group that we call the House. So the House represents all of the people that are working on solution development, which is done internally. And that really branches across two different things. It started with just our back of house applications. So all of the different applications that we use to run our own business. And that is, expense management, project management, just different finances, timekeeping, and all of the different back of house applications and recruiting that we use in order to run our business, we build out in Appian and we use internally. But in addition to that, we also have app market accelerators or full solutions that we can bring to our clients in order to make the development go a lot smoother. And one of the big advantages of building out these different applications for ourselves, in addition to the fact that we get to customize things to our own particular needs, is the fact that it really acts as a test bed for us to be able to figure out how we can systemize delivery. So how we can take process improvements and really experiment a lot within our in-house solution teams and development teams. And then as we find different pieces of efficiencies on how we can run projects, be it from sprint cycles, how we run retrospectives, how we are going to formulate different user stories so that they can be most effective, how we can have testing strategies that are going to be effective. We can take those lessons learned and really systemize them and bring them into our client work that we are doing with a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to work. And we are very big in this process for implementing process improvement. We are very quick to try and experiment with different new theories on how we are going to accomplish delivery in an effective manner. And when we find things that work, we are quick to bring them into our process and improve. But by nature of the fact that we are really using resources that aren't currently on projects or just sort of like working on side projects that they have as they have interest, we have a unique environment because it is extremely dynamic teams that have very fast transitions. So as an example, as part of our house sprint structure, we follow 2-week sprints, and it might be that somebody rolls off of a project for 3 days within that sprint, and they're only developing out 1 or 2 user stories. And when they move back onto another project at the end of that, we really have a challenge with trying to make sure that all of the different change objects that they have, all of the code that they have developed, can be easily transferred from one person over to another with not a lot of need to call back and do a lot of knowledge transfer beyond the fact that they have systemized and pushed their improvements over to the other person. And so this kind of like really gets into the root of our challenge that we had when we were developing out MAP. So in order to try and figure out exactly what we were trying to accomplish, just kind of frame it through the goals of DevOps as a whole. So for us, the first thing that we were really trying to tackle, and these kind of build on each other, is that we wanted to make sure that we were able to track the different change objects and the interdependencies between our objects that we have for different user stories as they were being developed. And really, for the first reason, is just awareness. If I have a user story that somebody is developing out and they commit their changes to the repository and get pulled onto a project, the person that is going to be doing code review on that is really going to need to be able to easily see what those change objects are, so that they can do some audit, and if they have any updates that they need to make in order to meet the acceptance criteria, they can figure out the things that they need to change in order to do so. And we don't want to spend a lot of time and overhead trying to figure out what those objects are and communicating back and forth. So that was the first challenge, just figuring out how we can see what objects have changed when we have a very dynamic environment. The next thing is just auditability and security. As we move up the chain, we want to make sure that we have an audit history of all of the objects that have changed through a development cycle, so that we can know as things are updated in the production environment and we see potentially any issues or anything that could come down from there, that we have a way of tracing where that would come back to, and we can see a history of all of the different changes that we've made as we go. And on the security side, more about how we are preventing things from getting pushed up to production that we don't want to get pushed, and make sure that everything follows the correct process of code review moving through. Then third, conflict prevention. So one of the big challenges that we could potentially have is if we have multiple stories that are touching the same pieces of code, and we don't necessarily want to get hung up if we have one user story which we don't want to push up to our production environment yet, and one that's complete, but they're using the same objects. We need to really easily be able to see what those conflicts are going to be so that we can manage our code base effectively there and not run into interdependency problems that prevent us from moving our code up to higher environments. And really, that is to help us accomplish fast, error-free deployments. Nobody wants to be sitting at their desk after hours when they're trying to do their deployment and have to go back and forth trying to figure out what the change objects are, find missing dependencies, track them down, try to understand what things are missing. And then if you push things to production and not realize that you were missing, a couple of database scripts, and then suddenly have issues in production that could be easily avoided if you just had everything that was tracked in a centralized location. So we really wanted to try and enable that with our solution for our DevOps. And then finally, consistent delivery. So it is very important for our process improvement cycle that we're able to consistently, every single sprint, deliver those process improvements to our main production application so that we can see what changes are coming in and really adapt as fast as possible. Okay, and so from that, I want to pass it over to David to give us a little bit more in-depth information about how we took these goals and pushed them over to MAP. So David?
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to be running through a couple of slides under my section of this presentation. First, we're going to be covering a quick lead up as to some of the solutions we've gone through on our way towards MAP as our delivery platform of choice. Some of the reasons why and benefits of that we've seen with MAP and using it in our production environment for a long period of time. And we're going to be covering a brief technical overview of how MAP works on the back end. So starting off, we move into talking about essentially why we developed MAP as a solution and how we kind of got here. We decided to move towards MAP essentially based on the growing scale of our deployment needs as a company. As our size of deployments and number of projects goes up, older methods of actually managing deployments become a little bit less viable over time. We have seen a number of issues that have cropped up with this that we've been trying to address over the years. First off, many different teams use many different strategies. Essentially, on every team that you would have, there is not really a good sort of standardization between what your deployment strategy happens to be. And you would see teams between different organizations or even different teams within the same organization that would use wildly different strategies and wouldn't really be compatible with one another. Along that same line, there isn't really any standardization between any of these teams. So if you bring, if you decide to work on a client team and you want to spin up a new stream of work, then you need to completely introduce that new stream of work to whatever different standardization that team has, and there isn't really a good level of knowledge transfer between those two, and it requires additional effort. And since varying different teams are using all these wildly different strategies, there is also a wildly different level of effort to the various different deployment strategies that were put forward. So the goal here is essentially to try and come up with something that will be shared amongst everybody and is already implemented, so you don't need to necessarily worry about a very large difference of effort, and to minimize the amount of downtime that you have with telling people, hey, this is how the new system works. Along the line to MAP, since MAP isn't really the first solution we've tried, we've gone through a number of possible solutions along the way as we've been scaling up. First off, we started working on actually storing all of our items in deployment-specific applications, essentially taking the baseline applications and giving them a more container-based structure, saying, hey, all of these objects are associated with this specific feature, and so all of these, you can tell which specific objects are being pushed up in individual applications. Essentially the equivalence of, instead of throwing all of your items into one large folder, separating them out into logical chunks. The next logical progression along from there is to use Google Sheets tracking of modified objects. Essentially, this takes the kind of organizational structure of storing items in deployment-specific applications and applies that benefit additionally to multiple different teams, allowing all this information to be publicly accessible and viewable by everybody to aid in coordination. And finally, the next step that we took prior to looking into MAP was making manual use of the Appian Deployment Manager tools, or ADM. Essentially, trying to take the already standardized or semi-standardized methodologies that we've been using and take them to the next level with cutting out some of the possible human interaction and potential for human error along the way. And building off of the use of the ADM tools, we move into how we reached MAP as a solution for us. One more, please. So MAP was built as a tool, ideally to streamline and standardize our deployments, with a number of goals that we tried to accomplish here. First off, we tried to make MAP useful for developers and very easy for developers to use. One moment, please. Yeah, we attempted to build out MAP that's very easy for developers to use. All of the developers on our internal teams are able to ramp up very quickly and figure out how to use MAP in a very short period of time. After you actually do any sort of application exports, you can operate fully in an Appian UI and don't really need to operate on the Appian backend in any way. Sorry, I seem to be losing my voice a bit. Additionally, once you learn MAP once, you can apply it to all products where you deploy it to, which aids in lowering ramp-up speeds. In addition to all of this functionality was directly related to deployments, we provided some additional value just past that. We have a rich permission suite for who can do what, allowing you to customize things at the very least on an environment by environment basis, with looking forward towards an application by application basis in the future. And we have a full version control backend that allows you to view an entire history of who changed what and what objects were changed to what in case something potentially goes wrong down the line. Additionally, we have a number of measurable benefits that we've seen from using MAP as our primary deployment tool in our production environment for a long period of time. We've managed over 900 different deployments across 90 different workflows and 9 distinct independent code bases that can operate in tandem with one another. And we have our per-sprint deployments, which, as Colin mentioned earlier, happen every 2 weeks. From a deployment time of potentially several hours down to an average or best average time of around 5 to 10 minutes. And the actual deployment complexity on an actual user perspective is driven all the way down to a single UI click to say, hey, take this branch and deploy it to the next environment.
And actually, if I may jump in a little bit on that, as the person who is doing the UI clicking myself, I can say that it is such a huge difference to be able to, even from a mobile device, if I wanted to, be able to click to actually drive the deployment without needing to have anything installed in my local machine, without having to, download or really coordinate with anybody outside of, if potentially, there is something that we want to communicate for the pre-deployment steps or post-deployment steps, just sort of communicating about that. It really makes such a huge difference in our deploy time and makes just life amazingly easier. But sorry to interrupt. I just really like that part of it.
No, it's all right. Thank you very much, Colin. Your input is very much valid and valued. Next, we'll be moving on to a quick technical overview of MAP. We'll be going over things at a high level over the course of deploying a branch of changes from one environment to another. And after this, we'll be moving on to a client-facing UI demo given by Wyatt. So at this point, we are assuming that our map environment and the entire functionality is divided into 3 major chunks: blue, orange, and green. Blue represents whatever your production environment happens to be, where map actually is installed. So this is where all of your developers and PS exec users, or anybody down the chain, will actually go into and look at map to see what's going on. The orange box represents the backend functionality that we've built out that very much is not user-facing. This consists of 3 separate parts, one being Jenkins, which can be potentially swapped out with future development for any sort of pipeline manager. SVN, which can be swapped out for any sort of version control. At this time, SVN is the only one we support. However, we are looking into support for Git in the future. And the Appian Deployment Manager, a plugin built by Appian that allows us to automate those deployments to a different environment. And finally, the third and final part is the green box, which is just the target Appian environment that you wish to move your changes to. So the normal progression of events essentially follows the numbered arrows that we see. We start off in map production and say, hey, for this branch A, we want to move it to the next Appian environment up the chain. So map puts together whatever requests it needs and sends that request over to Jenkins. Jenkins runs pre-prepared scripts to say, hey, I want to prepare this branch and start moving it up the environment, commits any changes necessary to our version control software. Once it receives confirmation that that's been done, it makes requests making use of the Appian Deployment Manager and goes and executes that deployment without any additional user input over to the new target environment. And after that's been done and it's been confirmed, the confirmation chain moves all the way back from the new target environment to tell ADM that it's finished, to tell Jenkins that it's finished, and to tell your original map instance that is finished as well. And then as a final step, map goes ahead and talks to its database to make sure that all 3 systems are in sync with one another, that the job was completed successfully. Now, additional features can potentially be added along this chain. One example would be, as I mentioned earlier, swapping out SVN for Git or some other sort of version control software. And it's very much expandable along the line if on a client you potentially have some need that falls slightly outside of what map currently covers. Now that concludes the technical overview that we've been seeing. I'm going to pass it along to Wyatt Tinsley, who's going to give us a user-facing demo of how map can be actually utilized.
Thanks, David. Let me go ahead and share my screen. What you're seeing now is the main page of map. So after you've logged into Appian and navigated to the map site, this is what you'll see. In the center here, you see the branches that you currently have access to. On the right side, you see actions you can take on the branch, as well as the action to create a branch. And then on the left side, you see the different records that you have available in map. Let me go ahead and click into the webinar branch here. This is where most of the functionality for map lives. Here in the branch record, you're able to see details about the branch. You can see all the packages that have been uploaded to the branch, and you can see previous deployments on the branch. In this case, we currently have one package uploaded and a previous inspection that was successful. The branch packages grid does show the environment each package is in. So if you're using a branch across multiple environments, you can easily track which environment has the most updated code. Up in the top right, you have the different actions you can take on the branch. Add package, which is what the developer will use to add code to the branch. Inspect and deploy, which will deploy the branch to the next environment in your chain. The ability to freeze a branch, which would lock actions on that branch, as well as the option to do an inspection only and not deploy the code in the branch. Adding a package is fairly straightforward. You provide a unique name, select the application you'd like to associate the package with, and then either upload a package file, a SQL file, or both. We do support SQL-only deployments, so if you need to make a database change without any associated code, Map will allow that. At the bottom here, you can see we have pre-deployment and post-deployment steps. These are free text entry fields that you can use to indicate that users should do something we can't automate, like add someone to a group, refresh a web page, or manually start a process model in a higher environment. We find particular value in freezing branches when we're doing deployments or when we are preparing for demos or giving demos. Freezing a branch locks a branch so that no actions can be taken on it beyond unfreezing the branch. This prevents developers from accidentally uploading code during deployments or causing collisions during a demo. Let me go ahead and kick off a deployment of our most recent package. On the deployment form, you can see similar detail as you could see on the branch record, as well as the environment you're aiming for and the option to add an import customization file. At the bottom, I can also see the post-deployment and pre-deployment steps enumerated. Here I have a post-deployment step to refresh the webinar site once the deployment is completed. So let me go ahead and kick off the test deploy. Back in the branch record, you can see that we now have a notification that a deployment is in progress, and our actions are hidden save for the ability to break a lock. In a perfect world, we'd never have any failures, but sometimes things happen, and Map can lock up if it does not receive a response from Jenkins. Break lock allows super users only to manually disable the lock on a branch and set a branch status so that if your deployment does in fact fail, you have the ability to change that and unlock it for your developers. Let's go back to the Map homepage for a moment. Here, we're also able to see that there is a deployment in process and our quick actions have been locked as well. If I navigate to our package, in the package record, I can actually see which items have been inserted in that package. So if you have a single package causing failures in your deployment chain, you can actually come here and try to track down exactly which objects are causing problems, rather than having to navigate through an entire application or code base hoping you find the correct item. In the user management tab, super users and configured user managers can add users to groups. We have two groups for deployments, the deployer and the deployment coordinator, as well as a user management group for people who should be able to manage user permissions, a read-only group for those who might need to access Map but don't necessarily need to take actions, and a super users group for people who need every permission in Map and then some. On the environments tab, if I jump into our test environment, you can see that you can manually configure both groups and individual users for both deployments and inspections. We find particular value configuring it so that our deployers and deployment coordinators can inspect and deploy up to our UAT environment, but we use the individual users to deploy to prod so as to ensure that the production database and production code base's integrity are maintained. If I head back to our homepage, I can see that our branch has been deployed. If I come in, I see the most recent deployment was successful. And if I click on that deployment, I can see additional details. Now, if I share my screen over to a simple site I've prepared for the webinar, we can see that the old value is this is an automated Map deployment. But if I refresh the page, we have an updated data demonstrating that you can conduct an deployment entirely within Appian. That concludes the Map demo, and so I'll kick it back to Colin.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that, Wyatt. And so I will share my screen again. And so the next thing that we wanted to talk about is just sort of like what the next steps are for MAP, and what we're looking to do, and kind of, advertising it here for as part of the webinar. So what we really want to do is try and bring our success to our customers. So as David was mentioning, as he was going through, some of the challenges that we have seen on different projects, we have a lot of different strategies that different teams are trying to implement. And we have had so much success even with our dynamic team and, a lot of different code bases. As he mentioned, we had 90 different applications across 8 different code bases. And so we really have seen a lot of success in being able to manage a lot of different parallel streams of effort, all being developed out at once, and achieved a really high velocity despite the fact that we have seen or had all of that dynamic behavior in our teams. And so what we really want to do is try and make it so that on customer engagements that we have, we can see that same kind of success that we have seen on our internal projects. And so now we have MAP for the masses. And so what we really want to do is offer this as a managed pipeline environment. So we have MAP as an encapsulated application where we have an environment that we have set up which manages all of the different pipeline systems and the repositories so that it's a really hassle-free environment to get installed and running on any customer's environment. Now that said, we are very aware that some environments have already existing infrastructure for DevOps. They might not be using Jenkins as their main pipeline tool. They might be using a different thing like Bamboo or something else. The nice thing about the way that MAP was built is that it's very structured so that it can be dynamic. We can take out the part that is integrating with the pipeline system and swap in a Bamboo environment. If we want to switch from SVN to Git, that's something that we can do, and it's the system is agnostic as to how it's going to integrate and which repository it's going to use. And so I'm really excited for the next steps here, and I really am looking forward to being able to bring that same pipeline tool to the different projects that we're going to have. And with that, I wanted to thank everybody for joining. I do see that we have a couple of questions. Let me see if I can read through some of them. So at the beginning, it's a little bit of an open-ended question. I think that it might be talking about when I was mentioning the security earlier on in the slide. Can you talk a little bit more about the security? So I suppose that hopefully I'll be answering the question. As for security with MAP, it's sort of in 2 different layers. So on the one hand, we have why it was just demonstrating, where we can set up environment-specific permissions for each one of the different sites and groups of people that can deploy to it. So in our environment, for instance, we have 4 different environments that we can push code to, and different deployment authorized groups can deploy code to each of the individual environments. We have one dedicated deployment coordinator who is able to actually do inspections up to the higher level environments, and then only a super user, the way that we have it configured now, is actually able to push code up to the production environment. And we have a lot of structure around that to make sure that we don't accidentally have things that get deployed to environments that we don't want, and we have a lot of visibility into who is deploying what where. I suppose maybe the other part to that is the credentials for the environment themselves. That was something that we were really concerned about, especially for us, since everybody that we have are Appian developers, right? And so we wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be possible at all for somebody to accidentally get credentials to an environment that they shouldn't have. And so we actually abstracted it out a layer so that we can use whatever the deployment pipeline tool is, in our case Jenkins, the credentials stored there in order to store whatever is going to be used to push up to higher environments, so that we don't actually send any credentials over the line to between different environments. We don't store any credentials in the MAP environment themselves. So that just is an additional layer of security that we had there. So hopefully that answered the question. So the next one is, are you required to have a Jenkins environment already installed? So I answered that right at the end of the presentation. And so actually, I'll just kind of go back, I think, a little bit to the technical architecture here. So really what we are describing is this environment right here in orange is what we would like to offer as a managed environment. So this is going to be hosted in an AWS environment, but Macedon is going to be the one that's going to set up the Jenkins environment, make sure that there's a repository configured to it, set up the ADM so that you'd install map on whatever environment is going to be the final environment, the production environment for you, so that it's not something that you have to set up and maintain yourself. And again, if there was an environment that did have infrastructure that was already set up locally, that would be something that we could, engage with and figure out how we wanted to install it. But have a lot of confidence that it's modular enough that we would be able to move and work with that environment. And then the third question: how can you configure automated testing with Map? So great question. So that's actually something that we are working on ourselves. So Map, like the rest of our application, is something that is very fluid, and we are very much still developing. And we have feature sets that we are trying to include as well. And automated testing is definitely one of the big next steps that we have that we want to incorporate into the system. So it's not quite there yet. But Jenkins is very able to integrate with any of the standard testing solutions that you have, be it the built-in Appian testing configurations that they have for testing rules and running process models that can test the entire suite of applications against test cases that are pre-configured. Or if you wanted to do functional testing like through fitness, those are definitely things that we can include in our pipeline. Map right now doesn't have support for them, but it's one of the big things that we're trying to have next on the pipeline. So yeah, that's all the questions that we had. So again, thank you very much for joining. If you'd like to hear more about Map, feel free to reach out, and we can definitely do another demo which is a little bit more in depth for you. Otherwise, look forward to other webinars that are coming in the future, and thank you again for joining.